So what exactly is happening in manual mode is you have the maximum control on all the three variables, which is aperture, shutter, and ISO. So if you want to shoot a particular portrait in a daylight, so you know that you need to start with say an ISO of about 100, which is more than enough because you have enough ambient light. You know that you have to shoot a portrait wherein you require background blur, so you might probably want to shoot it in f1.8 or f1.4. Now, based on either the exposure scale or the histogram, you can increase the shutter speed so that you get the correct exposure. In the same way, let's have a look at other examples how you can control things when it comes to manual mode. Now let's assume you want to shoot a landscape scene in a broad daylight. You know that you can use a lower ISO because it's a broad daylight and you know that you have enough ambient light. Also, considering it's a landscape, you want to use an higher aperture so that you get a maximum depth of field. Based on this higher aperture and also the lower ISO, your camera will start indicating whether the image is getting overexposed or underexposed. Use the back dial on your camera so that you can control your shutter so that you get your optimal exposure for the landscape scene. Then you have to wait for the camera to calculate something and tell you that this is a shutter speed I can shoot in. Now let's have a look at two more examples. Assume that you're shooting a kid who is running across the park and you want to freeze an action, and assume it's something which you're doing it in the evening. You know that there's pretty decent amount of light, but you might probably want to increase the ISO because you know that the light will reduce when the sun goes down, so you might probably want to start with say ISO 400. Second thing, you know that you're photographing a kid and you want to freeze an action, so you might probably want to use a higher shutter speed, which is say like 1 by 250th of a second or 1 by 500th of a second. Now, at this stage, use your aperture to control whether you want more background in the scene or you want less background in the scene. Now, considering it's a kid's photograph, you might want to reduce the aperture so that you can have a very clean background and have the subject stand out against the background. Now, at a lower aperture and higher shutter speed, maybe if you're seeing an overexposure, reduce your ISO, which is the best thing to do. But if you're seeing that your image is getting underexposed, you can't play around with your aperture and shutter speed because you might want to shoot with f2.8. First thing, because it's in the evening scene and also you want a separation in the background. Second thing is you want to freeze the action and you can't go anything below 1 by 250th of a shutter speed. That's where you might want to increase your ISO so that it can add in more light. So instead of using the exposure compensation button and playing around with that, you know what scene you're shooting, and based on the amount of available light which is there, you can change the variables. Let's have a look at one final example wherein you want to photograph like the motion trail of vehicles, like you're standing on top of a bridge and you want to do a long exposure traffic shot. Now that you know you need a longer shutter speed, you will increase your shutter speed to say like 1 second or probably even 5 seconds. Now, having said this, it's a night scene, so you might probably want to start with say like 400 or 800 ISO. Now, aperture is something which you want to use judiciously because it's night, and increasing the aperture to say f8 or f11 might cut down even more light and get the image very underexposed. So you might want to use a faster aperture, say like f2.8 or probably even f4, because it's a traffic scene and you want quite a lot of scene in focus. So you're using say like a 5 second shutter speed and you're using your aperture which is about say f2.8 or f4. Now, based on the exposure and also the end result that you're getting, you can play around with the ISO so that you get the desired result. This is where the advantage of manual mode really shines. And all this while, when we are talking about aperture priority or shutter priority and even probably manual mode, we are telling that the camera calculates the shutter speed required or the camera calculates the aperture required based on the scene and the metering mode that we have used. If you recall, we read about all the different metering modes that is there in a given camera, like matrix metering and center weighted and things like spot metering. Now you have to use this metering mode in conjunction with what is the scene that you're photographing so that the camera can decide and show you what is the correct value that you need to be using. Now let me break it up a little bit. For example, you're shooting a landscape scene, and if you're shooting in say aperture priority, you know that you're shooting say probably about f11 or f16, okay, and you kept your ISO at say 100 or 200 because it's a broad daylight. You need to ensure that you're on evaluative metering so that the camera can read the complete scene. You have a landscape and entire thing in the frame is of importance to you, and that's exactly the reason why using a correct metering mode is really very helpful. Now, contrary to that, if you're say you're shooting a person faced against a sky, or if you're shooting a person face against the sunset, and the person face is probably as small as what you're seeing me now, it's like about one third of the entire scene. Now, what happens if you use evaluative metering is that two-thirds of the frame is the sunset or the light which is coming and hitting the sensor, and you're probably using a smaller aperture like f2.8 or something so that you can get some sort of a depth and separation. Now, when you're using evaluative metering or matrix metering, what happens is the camera sees that a lot of light is coming in from the scene. It doesn't know who is your subject, it doesn't know what is the background or what is the light source. It just knows that a lot of light is coming in from the source, and it gives you a faster shutter speed to get you a correct exposure. But what happens if you are getting a faster shutter speed in your case? The subject will be rendered dark. This is exactly the case wherein you might want to use center weighted. Now you're telling the camera, give more importance to the center region of the frame wherein a person's face is there, and also evaluate the light based on the whole scene. Okay, so in this way, camera knows that it need not give you a faster shutter speed wherein it will render the subject dark, but it will give you a shutter speed which will make sure that your subject face is also visible against the bright sky. Say, for example, you're shooting a subject who is standing under a tree in a shade. Now it's a shade, and camera thinks that there is not enough light. Now, if you used evaluative metering, what happens? The camera automatically thinks that your scene is very dark and it tries to add light by giving you a slower shutter speed. But this is exactly where your decision on what metering mode to use is very important. You might want to go with center weighted, or you might even want to go with a spot metering wherein your main attention is the subject who is standing below a tree, and you want the subject to be exposed properly, and you want to tell the camera that meter from the person's face or the person's forehead or on the cheeks and give me the correct exposure value. Now the camera will not bother about the entire scene, whether it is dark or bright and what's there in the background. It reads the value only from the subject, the spot, which is usually the center of your viewfinder, based on where it is placed, which is ideally the face of the subject. So the camera will read the light value from the subject's face, and it will give you a corresponding shutter value. So this is exactly where your metering will come into picture, and using the right metering mode even before you start photographing is very, very important. So as you know, all these things are related. The metering mode that you use, what is the autofocus point that you're using, whether you're using multi-burst or whether you're using a single shot, all these things will come into picture. And as a matter of fact, when you're using the camera in manual mode, you have the maximum control on the image that you're shooting. So this is exactly the reason why I always suggest, before taking out your camera and photographing anything, be it your smartphone camera or it might be your DSLR or mirrorless camera, first spend a few minutes or probably few seconds thinking about what is that you're going to photograph. Key in the values which are ideal for that, then take a photograph. It makes no sense to pick up the camera and photograph and then say that, oh no, this doesn't turn out the way I want, and then fiddling with the settings on your camera. You know that you're shooting an action, you know that you're shooting a portrait, you know that you're shooting a landscape, or probably you know that you need a slow shutter speed. You key in the values before on hand. You can do that only if you're shooting in manual mode, or probably even in aperture priority or shutter priority, wherein you should know how and when to compensate for the light that is there in the scene. Use the exposure compensation button and use that to add or subtract light. So this is exactly how you use the manual mode on your camera to get the best possible results.